Good morning, oyster catchers, and welcome back. I hope you've had a really good half term. With a bit of luck, in a couple of weeks' time, we could be back at school. But in the meantime, let's carry on with Tom's Midnight Garden. So this chapter is number 15, chapter 15, XV1 in Roman numerals, and it's called The Treehouse. In a letter to his brother, Tom wrote, "I'm glad your measles are over. I wish you were here. We are building a treehouse in the steps of St. Paul's." Peter read the letter and then burnt it, as he must burn all Tom's correspondence now. He went sombrely out into the Longs' little back garden and began to put in some half-hearted work at a construction in the apple tree. Mrs. Long, watching from the kitchen window, called, "I wish Tom were home to help you." She spoke uneasily. She had told herself again and again that she completely trusted Gwen and Alan with the little boy, and indeed she did. Nevertheless, she sensed something unusual and mysterious in the air, and it troubled her. The Kitsons were better off than the Longs. There is all the difference in expense between having 2 children and having none at all. Tom might have been made discontented with his home by the luxury he was experiencing away from it. But he was not. Mrs. Long had to admit that. Tom's letters to his parents contained nothing but brief, dry reports of a dull life spent almost entirely in the company of his aunt and uncle. He did not seem to find any pleasure in it, not even in the meals now. Yet he had asked more than once to be allowed to stay on. "There are no other children there," Mrs. Long pointed out to her husband that evening, "and Tom never seems to go anywhere special. Does he tell you more, Peter, in his letters to you? They seem long enough." Peter looked at the ground. "I think he just likes staying in the flat." "Well, he'll get out of the mooning about indoors alone when he comes home," said Mr. Long cheerfully. "Won't he, Peter?" "I suppose he'll have to come home for school anyway. Nasty gnats. Gnats in this shed. Go away." "I suppose he'll have to come home for school anyway," said Peter. "He missed the end of the summer term because of my measles, but he'll have to come home when school starts again." "When the autumn term starts?" cried Mrs. Long in alarm. "Why, we must have him home before that, Peter." Peter looked doubtful, so Mrs. Long said, "You surely don't want to spend all this summer without Tom?" "I suppose," said Peter, and waited for them to ask what he supposed. "Well, I suppose that if Tom doesn't want to come away from Aunt Gwen's yet, I couldn't go there too and stay with him." Mrs. Long stared at her son, almost frightened, but Mr. Long laughed. "What on earth would 2 boys do in a poky flat without a garden?" "I'd like to be there with Tom," said Peter stubbornly. "You surely mean," said his father, "that you like to be here with Tom. You want to come home." "You can't really want to go and stay with him at a flat," said his mother. "I do then," said Peter. "I do. I lie awake at night and wish I were there. And then I fall asleep and dream that I am there. I want to go. I do. I do." "But why, Peter? Why?" asked his mother. Peter only cast his eyes down and repeated in a flat, obstinate voice that he knew he would like it. There the conversation was left without conclusion. That night Mrs. Long crept upstairs to the room that Peter shared with Tom. The door was ajar as usual, and she looked in. Peter was still awake. By the light of the street lamp outside she could see that his eyes were open, staring across the room at the picture postcard from Tom that he had propped up on the mantelpiece. Mrs. Long stole away, but came again later, and again. On the 3rd occasion Peter was asleep. She went right into the bedroom and stood over him, looking down at him. He must have been dreaming of something, for the expression on his face changed a little even in his sleep. Once he smiled and then sighed, and once such a faraway look came across his face that his mother bent over him with an impulse to wake him and recall him to her. She restrained herself and left him. On her way downstairs from the bedroom, Mrs. Long passed the tiny landing window that looked over the back garden. She saw black projections from the apple tree there, the timbers of Peter's treehouse. His construction was certainly not as advanced as the one in the steps of St. Paul's, although Mrs. Long, of course, was not in a position to make that comparison. Tom's treehouse, anyway, already had the start of Peter's. A start by as long as it takes for a letter to be written, delivered, read, and then burnt. Hattie works very hard at the treehouse, Tom had written to Peter. She likes the idea of it. There he understated her feelings. Hattie was deeply excited about the treehouse to a degree that quite surprised Tom. For one thing, she thought of it as her house in a way the big house was not. That was her aunt's house and her cousin's, and she was there only on sufferance. This treehouse, however, could be her own house and home, and she talked wildly of furnishing it with her doll's tea set, and even with objects filched from the spare bedrooms of the big house. Tom, in alarm, had to reason her into some sense. I should have put my glasses on today, I think. Then, again, Hattie loved the treehouse because it was the best of all her hiding places in the garden. Nobody would ever suspect it was here, she said, unless they had seen it being built. None of the cousins knew. Has Abel seen it? Asked Tom. He's never seen me carrying stuff or climbing up or even coming in this direction. I've been very careful to keep out of his sight. I haven't bothered about that, said Tom, but of course he's never seen me anyway. Of course not, agreed Hattie. And they changed the subject hurriedly, for their quarrel about ghosts, and which of them was one, was still fresh in their minds. However, as it turned out, Abel certainly must have known about the treehouse. That afternoon he was working in the garden, netting the strawberry beds. Hattie and Tom knew that because they always liked to locate Abel and anyone else in the garden before they went up to their treehouse. This time they made sure that only Abel was about, and that he was some way away. Then they climbed up. By now the house was finished, but Hattie still had ambitions. If it's to be anything like a real house, she said, it should have windows, not just accidental gaps in the walls. The windows must be oblong in shape, Hattie said, like those of the big house. You're expecting too much, Tom grumbled. And in the end, Hattie herself had to make the windows such as they were. There were two of them. They were still more like ragged holes than windows. Hattie worked patiently from the inside and then from the outside, plaiting twigs along the window edges, trying to make them straight and firm. Tom was not helping. He hoped that Hattie would tire of the idea of the house windows, and a house, although that did not seem likely at present. Then he would suggest a more interesting possibility, that the windows were, after all, portholes, and this was the captain's ship, or cabin on a ship at sea. Hattie never finished her windows. She was humming as she moved from one bough to another outside the wall of the treehouse. Then she stopped to call to Tom. Tom, there's a cracked bough this side. Is it all right? Have you ever sat on it? A cracked bough? Said Tom. Oh, yes, I've been out on that one. Hattie's humming was resumed jerkily as she began to move forward again. Only, Tom began to add, I dare say I'm different. I wouldn't advise you... He did not see it happen, but the cracked bough must have begun to creak and break at once, even at the first pressure of Hattie's slight weight. He heard the cracking, tearing sound. He heard Hattie's little "oh" of surprise that lasted only a part of a second before it became a scream as she felt herself falling. Hattie's cry was thin, high, one that pierced through all the garden. The birds rose and scattered at the sound. A red squirrel that was running along the nut stub tops froze to a branch, and Abel flung sorry, bear with me. Yes, Abel flung down his armful of strawberry net and began running in the direction of the steps of St. Paul's. Tom had jumped the whole height of the tree and had landed more weightless than a cat beside Hattie. He lay on the ground, dumb now and still. Her body was curved round, and in falling her pinafore had been flung up so that now partly covered her face. Where the fabric touched her forehead there was a bloodstain that crept along the fibres. Tom was still standing helplessly beside her when Abel thudded up. Abel saw the blood and groaned aloud. He picked up Hattie in his arms and began to carry her towards the house. Tom went with them. Then Abel stopped suddenly. He half turned round till he faced the spot where Tom was. Through all the numbness of his horror at what had happened, Tom realised that Abel was looking at him and not through him. And now he was beginning to speak to him. "Get you gone," said Abel hoarsely. Tom stared back at him. Neither of them budged. "Get you back to hell where you came from. I know you. I've always seen you and thought it best not to see you, and heard you and thought best to seem deaf, but I've known you and known for what you are." Tom ignored all except that Abel could hear him and therefore could answer him. "Oh," he cried, "do you know, is Hattie alive or is she dead?" "Aye," said Abel. "You've tried to kill her often enough. Her, that had neither mother nor father nor home now. Nothing but her innocence against your devilry with bow and arrows and knives and high places. Now I say, get you gone." Tom did not go, but Abel, still carrying Hattie, began to back away across the lawn and towards the house. As he went, he repeated in a loud voice the prayer which Tom had thought only to be a grace after meat. "May the Lord keep me from all the works of the devil, that he hurt me not." Abel's voice shook, and he stumbled with his burden as he felt his way ever backwards, with his eyes fixed upon Tom, up the garden doorstep and through the garden door. The garden door was slammed, and Tom heard the sound of the bolt going home. Then Tom woke from amazement. He ran forward to the door and flung himself upon it, wildly beating his fist on the wood and calling first upon Abel to let him in, and then upon Hattie. The door remained shut. His crying and knocking brought no one. Of those that might have heard him and let him in, it seemed that no one would not, or the other could not. Wow, so we know now that Abel can actually also see Tom, which Tom didn't suspect up until this moment, when Hattie had fallen out of the tree and hurt herself, knocked herself unconscious, had damaged her head. Wow, the story's getting a really interesting now, and a bit of a twist in the tale, as we say. So your plan today, or your task today, is actually to plan a story of your own based on a special garden. Now, the details are following. Good luck. Take care. Bye-bye.